Hi, I'm Matt Breunig, and today I'm going to show you how to use some of your scrap bezel wire in order to make a stacker style ring. For today's project, we're going to be using a hammer, a ring mandrel, an annealing pan, sterling silver easy solder, some floral pattern wire, a hot pick soldering pick, a honeycomb soldering pad, a ring holder, some 14 gauge sterling silver wire, a Smith little torch, a new concept saw frame, some 6/0 saw blades, some green flux, the boric acid, which is mixed with denatured alcohol for soldering. I'm going to mix together some boric acid and denatured alcohol. This is used for soldering sterling silver or gold, and what it does is it helps prevent fire scale when heating the piece up. So I'm going to add a little bit of that boric acid, and then denatured alcohol you can get at any local hardware store. You can use a baby food jar or any type of a container, and then just kind of mix that up. And now you have get your soldering done. So today I'm going to show a way to utilize some leftover pattern wire here. Often you're using a whole section of this bezel wire, and then you come down to the end as I did. And so I had one little piece left, and I didn't want to, just melt it down or anything. So I utilized it to make this little silver ring here with a small pink CZ set into the center of it. So what I do, you got down to the end of the wire, and I use a saw frame to cut one of those free. So there's a little flat piece of wire in between each of the floral pieces. In the case with my ring, I was down to the end, so you just have to do some basic cleanup around the flower petals in order to use this one little piece for a ring. Now we have one little flower to work with. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to fill the little floral piece here. I'm going to fill this hollowed out area on the back side of it with solder, and I'm using the easy solder, which is already clipped up right there. I got to dip it into boric acid and alcohol and then ignite it. And I'm going to dip it a second time. You want to make sure that it's extinguished before you put it into the boric acid and alcohol, because it is flammable. Now, using a pretty fluffy flame. When I say fluffy, I mean not a very intense flame. This is what I would describe as, pretty intense. That's going to be too hot, and it's more than likely going to melt the little flower piece that we have. We're going to add a little bit, just a very small amount of green flux to the back of that. So I basically charged the whole back side of this with the flux, and so that's going to give basically a place for the solder to adhere to the underside, the hollow side of this flower. So what I like to do is stage a couple pieces of the solder. If we were looking at a clock or a compass would be north, south, east, and west, maybe a couple more than that, just so that we have an even flow. What's nice about the hot pick is that it has a machined end that is hollowed out at the end that allows you to pick up a solder piece, and they're all numbered according to the size of solder that you're trying to pick up. So number 1 is a very fine tip, and number 2 is your average tip. That's what I'm using here, is a number 2 hot pick. And so I intensified my flame slightly, but keeping it pretty fluffy, not sharp. And moving slowly over the piece, you can see that it's getting ready to flow. And we're going to stop right there. When in doubt, back out. And what we're going to do is go ahead and take this and then quench it in. This is pickle right here. And then using a pair of copper tweezers, pull the piece out of the pickle and then just rinse with water. Got a pretty good surface area on there, a little flux residue. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do the process again. Go ahead and use up the little pieces of solder that I have left here, quench it again, just to get it a nice clean surface area. So this is 14 gauge sterling silver wire. I've uncoiled it from the package so that I can basically manipulate it around the mandrel. So I kind of start with a slight curve. This is dead soft, so it's pretty easy to just bend around a mandrel. You can of course use half round pliers if that's easier for you to use. And so what I like to do is get it started on a smaller size than what the intended finish size is going to be, because I'm going to put a hammered finish on this ring. And so I'm bringing it on around, and I'm probably, let's see, we're at about a size 5.5. I'm going to make that a little bit smaller. By making it smaller, I'm just coiling it around a little bit tighter. You can see now it's about a 4.5. Now that I got my coils made, I'm going to use my fancy bench pin to cut off a couple rings. I'm only going to use one for this project, but it's always good to have an extra ring around. What I love about this fancy pin is that you can utilize it in a lot of different ways. You can see all the different shapes for piercing, getting into tight corners and things like that. But what is most intriguing to me is this area right here, which is used for sizing rings. And so that's basically what I'm going to do in fabricating this ring. And so put the coil right over the top of that, and then I come right up to it. What I like about that is I can hold my wire securely in my middle finger and my thumb, and then cut through them one at a time. There's one. Now I have 2 little rings. So I've got my ring cut, and what I'm going to do is create some tension in here so that we can get a nice even solder. You can see that the wire is running past each other, and so what that is doing is creating some tension on the circumference of the ring. So pull it out and then line it up so that there's as little seam as possible. Make sure that everything is even, top, bottom, and side to side. And I'm going to use the ring holder to hold this in place while I solder. But first, I'm going to dunk it in boric acid and alcohol to get it nice and clean. Ignite it. I'm going to let that extinguish and then put it onto the ring holder. My seam is up. I'm going to add a little green flux right to the seam where I'm going to be doing the soldering. And this is a hard solder that I am welding it in place with. It's got a little higher temperature for melting temperature. Carefully remove that because these brass pieces are probably hot. You want to try not to touch them with your fingers. And then drop it in the pickle and in the water to clean it up. So now I'm going to do a hammer finish on here. I have it on the mandrel. It's approximately a size 6. So keep in mind every time you are hammering on a ring, you are expanding the size. So it may be a 6.5, maybe a 7 by the time we get done hammering on it. And this is just providing a slight texture. And it'll be somewhat flat on the outside and still rounded on the inside for comfort. We've got a hammer texture all the way around. And after we solder our little flower on top, we can do a little bit more hammering, texturing as needed. All right, so I'm going to use my ring holder to balance my little flower on top of the hammer ring. And what I'm going to do is manipulate this. These 2 posts are brass. And it's one continuous piece. You can see that on the underside is one piece of wire that is threaded through, it comes back up. So you don't have to worry about breaking it away from its stand. And so I'm just going to bend it and manipulate it to where it's going to be jeweler friendly for me to balance the flower on top. That. So what I'm going to do is I went ahead and started my torch. I'm going to dip the pick down into the boric acid and alcohol. You'll notice that I'll reapply more. And then so basically what that is doing is creating a good area for the solder to adhere. I'm not going to use any green flux for this soldering application because often, if that is to dribble down the side of the ring, that will create an area where the solder wants to flow, and so you'll end up having excessive solder welded down the ring. You want to focus the majority of the heat on to the ring, not necessarily the flower, because the flower is the thinner of these 2 pieces, and so is more likely to melt down before the ring. I'm using a fluffy flame, and I'm moving it quite a bit. Just trying to keep an eye on when that solder flows. And there it went. It all happens at once. Again, be very careful removing that. You don't want to put your fingers on the brass pieces because they are hot. And we quench it. All right, so I have my piece completed. The little flower is soldered on top of my hammered ring. And I did tumble this a little bit, but if you don't have a tumbler, you can use the 3M polishing paper and then just kind of, you know, rub it, and that'll take any tarnish off. Of course, the quenching in pickle helps get all flux and any residue left over from the boric acid and alcohol off of it. But these are really nice as far as like brightening it up, and there are different grits available. And then these little polishing pads are also a nice option as far as a finish polish. Now, if you want, if you're more advanced, you can go ahead and set like a small stone like that into the center of the ring, or it looks great just as a stacker by itself. It's a nice little shape to it, you know, and a great way to use that weird little flower that you have at the end of your bezel wire. And you can see that it stacks up well next to another ring, or you can put this next to a color stone ring, and it's just a great complement to anyone's collection of stackers. Thanks for watching today. Hopefully this showed you a good way to utilize some scrap type things that might be hanging around your shop. Take a look around. You may find something that you can repurpose and make into a new piece that you're going to love.